full screen in a moment, just because I can see there are more people still coming into the session. But hopefully you can all see my slides. So I'm going to be talking about professional identity, librarians, and social class. And this, similar to what Lottie was saying, this is based on some early days analysis that I've taken from my PhD. So I'm going to be looking at the differences between librarians from working class and middle class backgrounds when it comes to the origins, the meaning, and the expression of their professional identity. Just to give you a bit of context about my PhD study and what it involves, here's a quick sort of 2-minute rundown of my PhD. I'm almost 4 years into a part-time PhD at University College London, and my whole PhD is looking at how social class shapes the professional identity, professional behaviours, and activities of UK academic librarians. It's a mixed method study, so I use quantitative and qualitative data. The first phase of the study involved a survey where I had 621 UK academic librarians fill in a questionnaire, and I was looking at their social backgrounds. I used a statistical method called latent class analysis, and this uses statistical modeling to identify groups within the data. So it looks at all your data and says there are these, however many clusters in the data that are present. Based on what their answers were to different things, which in this case was features of their social background. The analysis showed, go to full screen here. The analysis showed that there were 3 distinct groups present in the data. There was a group that I'm calling working class librarians, who were typically first generation students, so the first in their family to go to university. Their caregivers typically worked in manual occupations, and they reported experiencing varying degrees of economic precarity during their childhood. The second group I've termed as being sort of professional managerial backgrounds. These had caregivers, typically parents who were highly educated and worked in well-paid professional jobs. And thirdly, there was a sort of lower middle class group who had highly educated parents, but they were typically working in professional jobs which didn't pay quite as high. I'm not going to go into any more detail about this phase of the study because I'm most interested in the sort of qualitative findings here. So for the second phase of the study, this involved qualitative interviews with 21 academic librarians, 7 from each of those 3 groups. I did narrative analysis, which looked at their journeys into and then through librarianship. And then I also did thematic analysis to identify any common themes and experiences present in each group. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm bundling together, I'm just looking at my working class librarians and the professional managerial background librarians, as these are the 2 furthest apart on a social class hierarchy. And I want to use that to try and show and highlight differences in professional identity rather than try to coalesce things together. I'm just going to check no, we don't have any participants waiting to come in, so we shall move on. So how can we define and think about professional identity and what this means, particularly to librarians? So when I was starting to think about professional identity, I was looking for some good definitions, and one that particularly stuck out to me as being quite useful, particularly at this early stage of my research for this second phase, is Pearson et al. Now, that team conducted a pretty large review of literature on librarians and professional identity, and I'm using that as the basis of this presentation. So Pearson et al. Identified 15 common themes in the literature to describe how librarians' professional identity is understood, how it's shaped, and how it's experienced. So these 15 themes are things which came across in the literature that they reviewed. I don't have time to cover all of these, but I've picked out some of these 15 themes to sort of focus in on and to look at the potential differences here between librarians from different social class backgrounds. Um, just as a note, I'm citing primarily from this review by Pearson et al. So unless it's otherwise noted, that's where my references are coming from. But I'm also drawing on some sort of secondary citations that they've used as well for particular things. Now, it's important to note also at this stage that of all the 21 librarians, academic librarians I interviewed, I would say all but two of them were quite positive about having a professional identity as a librarian. So they did report having a sort of moderate to strong professional identity as a librarian. Um, so that was almost universal across all groups. Where it becomes interesting is the differences when I sort of teased out a little bit more about what that professional identity meant to them. That's when we can start seeing some of these differences and some of these potential differences which might be related to social class. So the first of these themes that I wanted to pull out from the Pearson et al. Review is primary identity. So within the review and sort of citing Treed et al., primary identity was sort of understood as this identity is a person's understanding of who and what they are, both within and outside the context of professional practice. And that part of professional identity is the negotiation of these selves as they interact. So this idea of primary identity is a person's understanding of who they are, what they are, both within and outside of the context of librarianship. So who you are and how you see them, and how those two different aspects sort of interact together and negotiate with each other. So comparing this theme between the two different groups that I had, or that I'm looking at, working class and middle class librarians, I'm going to focus in on the middle class librarians first. So middle class librarians or librarians from middle class backgrounds typically reported having a unified professional and personal identity. Their professional self sat with them whether they were at work or not, and it was integrated into their sense of self. Similarly, their outside of work identity came with them to work. These two things were unified and integrated together. They said that they saw themselves as a professional, as a librarian, and that this sat comfortably with them. It didn't feel like any sort of conflict to describe yourself as being a professional and a librarian. And you could also see this in how they described their time outside of work, when they're talking with their friends and family, and there wasn't any sort of sense that came across really of any dislocation. So Louise, one of my participants, sort of talks about this a little bit here, that I definitely think their professional and personal identities fit together. Probably partly because outside of work, my husband, I suppose he's the same. He's sort of a professional. A lot of the people I mix with are probably colleagues who've become friends. They're people from university and school that I've kept in touch with, most of whom went to university. So the social circle that Louise is interacting with are people that are familiar from similar backgrounds to herself, and it feels this identities feel like they fit together. Now, in contrast, not for all, but for many of the working class librarians, they reported a professional identity that was often quite outside of and often sometimes at odds with their sense of self. They tended to leave their professional identity at the library and didn't discuss things about work with friends and family. Um, at extreme levels, they often felt that their professional self was in opposition to their true self. So they were having to be somebody different when they were at work. And they had strategies as well, sometimes of downplaying and concealing their professional status outside of work settings. So when they were spending time with friends and family, they might sort of conceal some elements of their work and what they do for a living, and what that means in order to fit in better. Or in the case of Olivia here, she described, most people's idea of what you do as a librarian is kind of public library stacks, stack the books, tidy up kind of thing. And I don't know what, whether it's because I don't want anyone to think I'm trying to be, am I too posh or something? And if everyone else is having a certain, discussions about things, you don't want to sound like you're out on a limb or something. So Olivia's talking about sort of hiding about what her job actually involves because it can make her stand out, or it can make it seem like she's being sort of too big for her boots almost. And this came across particularly when people were talking about having gone away to university and then going back to their hometown. This sense of, particularly in Australia, I think it's called tall poppy syndrome sometimes, not wanting to look as though you've sort of got above or better than people from where you're from. So this idea of this professional identity being separate, it being limited, and it being fragmented. And librarianship was an objectified job rather than an embodied identity. If I could sum it up, for middle class librarians, librarianship was something that you were, whereas for working class librarians, librarianship is something that you do. So, the second theme that I wanted to pull out is about education and training. So, education and training is this key area in the literature. So, formal education in a profession defines an identity and inculcates a sort of common culture between people that therefore shapes that professional identity. So, both the level of education and training for a professional, but also what is included in that education will shape people's professional identities once they're in that profession. So again, here we saw some difference between my two groups. Most of the librarians from middle class backgrounds I interviewed followed a fairly traditional career trajectory. They went to university at 18, they decided that they wanted librarianship as a career, and then they either worked for a year or so, or they got a graduate trainee position and then went to library school to qualify. A few within that group as well went straight from undergraduate straight into a librarianship MA without having getting any prior experience of working in a library as well. Their drive to study librarianship was often about developing their knowledge of a discipline, and I would say that it sort of sat within a liberal tradition of education. So that idea of education for education's sake. Typically, they began to see themselves as a librarian once they were qualified. So once they'd got a postgraduate qualification, they saw themselves as a librarian. So Anna here, who I've quoted, the quote says, yeah, I mean, librarian feels very comfortable to me and probably has been. I mean, getting the master's was like, I'm a librarian now. Like, no matter what my job title is, I feel I've earned it. So having the qualification made Anna feel like a librarian. Now, sometimes that could cause some tensions, particularly where some people in this group had less practical experience. So they often had to work in paraprofessional library assistant roles after qualifying before getting their first professional post. And that could cause some tension because they saw themselves now as a librarian, but they're doing the work of a paraprofessional. Now, those from working class backgrounds often had quite a different shape to their career. They'd often worked for longer in libraries before becoming qualified, and often outside of academic libraries first. So might have started in public libraries, school libraries. Middle class librarians I interviewed typically went straight into academic libraries. Often they'd got a job, they weren't necessarily stepping into libraries intending to become a librarian, but they got a job there. It was a good job, and then they did a postgraduate qualification in order to sort of get on. And often they sat within and they discussed LIS education in more pragmatic terms, and within more of a tradition of vocational education. They saw they saw themselves as a librarian typically once they'd gotten their first professional post. So for them, it's the work which makes you a professional. For middle class background librarians, it's the qualification. Okay, so I'm just going to take a drink of water. So the next thing I want to talk about is this identity space dichotomy that Pearson et al. Talk about. This describes about how professional identity is shaped by the local and the global sort of sense of place. Um, so the local is the individual culture and practices of the library in which a librarian works, and the global being a sort of sense of being an individual within a national or an international profession. So this sense of you also part of becoming a librarian is being in a library, being in that space, being in the wider profession. So what are some of the differences here between the groups? So typically for librarians from a working class background, their identity and their practices as a professional were more shaped by the local. They tended to see themselves as a professional within the immediate context of their institution. So I am a librarian at this particular university. Their professional networks and the influential individuals that they talked about were typically quite localized to them. That doesn't mean just in a geographic sense, but there was fewer degrees of separation between them and an influential individual or a network of people. Often they were made up of people that they'd worked with previously or they were working with currently. And these were usually strong ties based on personal relationships that they had built up. In contrast, librarians from more middle class backgrounds, they tended to see their professional identity as being within a wider context of a profession and a community of practice. So they were more independent of the individual institution that they happened to be working in currently. So they saw themselves as a librarian working in a profession of librarians who happened to be working in XYZ university at this time. Their professional networks were typically broader but with weaker ties, and they felt more comfortable building bridges across multiple institutions. So having networks which spanned multiple institutions that were tended to be bigger, but maybe not quite as close. And a good example of this was they tended to report feeling much more comfortable with things like conferences than people from working class backgrounds. In addition, they tended to form professional connections via formal organisations. So things like serving on working groups, serving on a committee, volunteering with a professional association. These were often how they developed their networks. Okay. Let's see where we're up to. So I've got two more themes to cover, so I think it should be all right. So the theme about blurring, this talks about the potential for professional identities to encompass or integrate additional identities within it. Branchmuller and de Groot note particularly this idea of the hybrid teacher-librarian professional identity, which encompasses an educator identity within an existing librarian identity. And this was something that came up as a real contrast between some people in the groups. Now, this teacher librarian professional identity, this was all the rage when I was at library school. So this I found really interesting. So not everyone I interviewed was working in a role which involved education or teaching, but where it did, some interesting things sort of came up. So when it did apply to middle class librarians, they were often quite open to, or they actively sought a more blurred professional identity. They wanted to be seen as, say, a teacher in addition to being seen as a librarian, or an educator in addition to being a librarian. And you can sort of see this in Imogen's quote here, um, talking about having to sort of retrofit teaching into their professional identity, and how that's sort of been able to expand their horizons a bit. But sometimes being able to mix between whether they identify as a librarian or a teacher or as an educator in different ways. Now, in contrast, this was only a few of the working class background librarians that I interviewed, but they were very, very different on this, um, if they did bring it up. So they were quite forthright in their professional identity as being a librarian exclusively, despite any additional roles that they took on. They might be heavily involved in teaching, but they rejected the teacher librarian identity. For them, they were a librarian who teaches, not a hybrid teacher librarian. And Tanith was very, very firm on this one. I'm definitely a librarian, not a teacher, and really pointed out that the difference between her peers across UK universities, um, and identified that maybe part of this is if you're a teaching librarian, you get a little bit of extra status, as she saw it. For others, there was a few other sort of features of sort of blurred professional identity as well. Some of the people that I interviewed from middle class backgrounds, um, they often had sort of sought out a particular niche or specialist status within their career or within their institutions. So they wanted to be the data librarian or the special collections specialist or the teacher librarian, something that sort of made them stand out in some way. And that made them feel a stronger sense of professional identity. The working class librarians typically didn't really discuss this, and they seemed a bit more comfortable with a more generalized status that was broad and flexible enough to fit into whatever role or whatever institution they were working in. Um, okay, this is my last theme that I'm going to cover. So, the Pearson et al. Study also identified stereotypes as being a really particular thing when it comes to librarians' professional identity. Jordan Wilkins and Hussey described this dichotomy wherein librarians resolve their professional identity by either conforming to or rejecting the stereotypes that there are out there of librarians. So, unsurprisingly, pretty much everyone that I interviewed largely recognized the common stereotypes of librarians, and these stereotypes were largely gendered and to a certain extent quite classed. This image of female, middle class, white lady librarian, buttoned up, buns, whatever. So librarians from middle class backgrounds largely fitted in with that dichotomy that was described before. They either accepted or they defined themselves against the stereotype. If they rejected the traditional sort of twin set and pearls stereotype, they often talked about the things which made them different to that or made them stand against it. So talking about things like tattoos, piercings, dyed hair, fashion, and often this sort of leaked into a little bit of another stereotype that we see. I've seen termed the rebel librarian, the blue hair librarian, whatever, but almost that idea of, this isn't your mother's librarian, this is something different. But they did fit within that sort of dichotomy that was described. And Anna here says, I almost feel that there are two, even in academic libraries, there are two librarians. You've got your old-fashioned button-up cardigan type, which I maybe lean a bit towards, and then you've got the I'm not your stereotypical librarian look. Now, for working class librarians, recognition of these stereotypes didn't seem to necessarily mean that they accepted or rejected them. For them, rejection of the stereotype wasn't so much about defining against it, but more about seeking a sort of image or an aesthetic that was comfortable and authentic to them, who they were as people and their background. in some ways, the sort of rebel librarian image was as constricting and as cultivated a stereotype as that traditional one. One thing that came in particular with a couple of the people that I spoke to from working class backgrounds was that they often felt, as working class women, they felt judged for their appearance when I interviewed them. Um, and it was things around the sort of they felt as judged by the sort of stereotype group and the aesthetics of sort of presentability that they went through that was comfortable with their class background. So things like having your hair done, wearing makeup, having your nails done, wearing colourful clothes, things like that seem to be as judged. And Tanith summed this up really nicely. She said, in libraries, a lot of women don't necessarily wear makeup, or, and I do. I think that for a long time, I didn't wear makeup at work. I wouldn't actually paint my nails. I wouldn't wear my hair down for a long time because it's such a in your face kind of thing. But yeah, try and tone it down. Whereas, I enjoy clothes and it's part of how you express your personality. And I think a lot of working class people use clothes too. They enjoy clothes and they enjoy shopping and it's just expressing. That's why they like having their hair done. It's how you express yourself. And Tanith didn't feel for a long time she was able to do that in libraries. Okay, so I've got a few minutes left, so I just want to briefly talk about some of these implications, if these are my sort of final findings. So it's worth saying this is very, very early days for this research. I've only shared some sort of first initial observations from my first sort of pass of coding at the data. But what might this sort of tell us about class and professional identity in librarianship? So typically, I would say literature on professional identity in librarians looks at just the professional context and the environmental factors when it comes to professional identity. So libraries and library work are like this, therefore, librarians' professional identity is like that. I want to suggest that there's some evidence that the differences in how librarians develop and enact their professional identity, some of this may have origins in their social class or in other elements of their background, and that the resultant experiences of them entering into and moving through librarianship as a career. When it comes to developing professional identity, for middle class librarians, this might largely be seen as confirmation to sort of expected types and expected experiences. Their professional identity is in line with their expectations, with their experiences, and it feels comfortable, and it is the majority view. For librarians from working class backgrounds, though, developing a professional identity may be more problematized. It's not a natural fit, and thus they experience processes of either assimilation, so having to reject a previous culture and adopting a new one, or acculturation, where they're having to try and reconcile two different identities into one. I would also say that the potential degree of alignment between the common view of what developing a professional identity looks like, so the processes and experience that make this up, with that sort of middle class experience, that does lead me to ask, is it just about developing a professional identity, or is it about also becoming comfortable with a middle class identity? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I have literally 1 minute left, if there are any quick questions in the chat. I can't see any questions in the chat, so I am going to stop there. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along to my talk. I will stop the recording.